Before we get going on today's show, I want to remind everyone that the Kickstarter campaign for Bard Song, the 7th novel in my ongoing heroic fantasy series, The Glimmer Chronicles, is currently in progress. We've passed the initial funding goal and are now speeding towards stretch goals. So if you like what I do here, like my stories, please go to michaelkingswood.com/bardkick and consider backing the campaign. Hi friends, I'm Michael Kingswood. It is story time, and we are back for Story Saturday. As always, we are reading stories that I wrote. This year, we're going through the stories that I wrote last year. I wrote 57 stories, put out 52 of them into 4 collections of 10 and 1 of 12, one for each week, and we're going through them this year on the channel. This week is the 9th story that I wrote last year, but it's number 7 in Volume 1, and it's called Miss Melody and the Jail Cell. Now, Miss Melody is a character/setting that I created a couple years back. You'll see what it is. It's a mystical cafe where people get their problems kind of solved. Kind of a portal fantasy kind of thing. And this one is, it's about a jail cell. Kind of. I wrote it, so it's awesome. I'm reading it, so it's awesome. And you guys will enjoy it. Hopefully. Sit back and let's tell a story. Talk to you on the other end. The Uber came to a halt in front of the James County Courthouse, and for a moment Timothy just looked out at it through the window. A solid mass of gray concrete, with severe lines and tiny slivers of windows that stacked atop each other like the wounds from some great claw that had been dragged down across the face of the cubic building. It was colorless, bleak, ugly, and uninviting. A fitting place to house the mockery of justice that was our modern system. He swallowed, adjusting the blue and white tie he wore beneath a cheap navy blue sports coat. He didn't have the rest of the suit to go with it, so he had on dark blue jeans and a white collared shirt. Fortunately, the sports coat concealed the shirt's short sleeves. He watched as people streamed up the half-dozen concrete stairs leading up to the courthouse's main entrance. Many of them appeared to be lawyers in slick, tailored suits with briefcases in their hands and cell phones to their heads. Others were average Joes and Janes like Tim, hoping to escape the clutches of the system with freedom and at least some small amount of cash left in the bank, after the vultures feasted on their accounts. Well, Tim thought for a moment not completely like him. He wasn't in danger of going away to a cell for years. That was his brother. But Tim's bank account had felt the pecking nonetheless. "We're here, buddy," said the driver from the front seat. He was early middle-aged, with friendly blue eyes and a close-cropped blonde beard, starting to go gray, that matched the curly hair atop his head. Tim turned to look at him and found that friendliness still there, but there was an insistence about his demeanor now, a "get out, I got things to do" feel. Tim couldn't blame him. Another pickup request had come in 2 blocks ago, and the guy wasn't out here taking schlubs like him around for his health. Money to be made, all that. Still, for a couple seconds, he felt a flash of anger at the man, like he was forcing Tim into the inferno that just might burn away everything he had known in his life to this point. He almost lashed out, but he stopped himself. Not the guy's fault that Sam had done what he did. So instead he nodded, said a quick thanks, and then got out. The Uber sped off almost as soon as he closed the car door behind himself, and Tim wished he could be within it. Sentencing was today, and he feared it was going to be bad. Looking up at the court building, Tim wondered if he would ever see his brother alive and free again after today. There was some hope. Sam had never been in trouble before. Still, the scene around him dimmed noticeably, and though he knew it was just a cloud passing in front of the sun, Tim felt a shiver of dread pass up his spine. Like the cloud had been God's confirmation of every fear Tim was harboring right then. The moment passed, and Tim had to inhale deeply to suppress the shiver that wanted to become physical. Man up, he told himself. It might not be that bad. He really didn't believe it, but he squared his shoulders anyway, then resolutely stepped onto the first step leading up to the courthouse. And his brother's fate. 40 years. Tim trudged down the street from the courthouse, his hands in his jeans pockets like a dead man. He could see, but despite the sunlight shining down and the brisk cleanness of the springtime air, the world was just a blur of shadows. He could hear, but the whizzing of cars and the rumble of conversations from other pedestrians around him was muted, as if he was wearing earmuffs. The world had lost form, muted and shadowed by the enormity of the concept that he was still struggling to come to terms with, even now almost an hour after the judge handed down the sentence. 40 years. Next time he saw his brother in the real world, Sam would be almost 70. At 22, that was something Tim just couldn't wrap his head around, and it left him with a lead weight of despair in his gut as he walked aimlessly toward somewhere. He hadn't bothered with an Uber when he left the courthouse. He wasn't sure he could have thought how to even request one. He just turned right and walked. And tried not to think, though the thoughts kept coming regardless. 40 years. What was he going to do? When their parents were killed in a car crash when Tim was 13, Sam left college, came home, and got a job to provide for Tim while they finished up junior high and high school. Since then, he had been the rock Tim leaned on every time he needed help, or a comforting hand, or just a kick in the ass. Now he wouldn't be there. Also, what was Sam gonna do? Sam wasn't a criminal. He'd never been in trouble in his life until he left the bar he and his buddies had been hanging out in and turned left when they turned right. He made another turn and ran into a guy in ratty clothes holding a gun on another guy who was begging for his life. Sam always had a gun with him. State law said he wasn't supposed to in a bar, but the Constitution is the law of the land, not the whim of a tyrant in the local statehouse. When he saw that guy trying to kill the man who was begging, Sam pulled his weapon and ended the threat. The guy he saved didn't thank him. He hauled ass away. When the cops showed up, Sam learned the guy he shot was an undercover, and he quickly found himself cuffed and booked, charged with killing a police officer along with a ton of lesser-included felonies, and the misdemeanor of carrying while under the influence. If his case had been tried 20 miles away across the state line, he would have been tried under the reasonable man theory based on what he knew at the time, but here the law for defense of others still put the knowledge of the person being defended upon the defender, and the guy Sam defended knew he was a perp being taken into custody, so he had no right to resist the cop. Sam didn't know that, couldn't know that, but the law didn't care. It treated him the same as the perp. The DA went further, though. He dug through 10 years of social media and found one conversation where Sam had not shut down a racist, and used that to say that since the cop was black, Sam had killed him from racial animus. That made it a hate crime. Now, Sam was an innocent man wrongfully convicted, a righteous man sent to live with murderers, rapists, and scum for most of the rest of his life. How could he survive that? How? Tim wanted to scream to the heavens about the injustice of it all, to shake his fist at God. How could he allow such a thing to happen? Fury, terrifying rage wanted to burn through the ennui that coated Tim's soul as he walked, but those fires flickered impotently against the armor of numb disbelief that encompassed his conscious mind. The anger was there. He felt it, lived it, was it, but he could not give voice to it. It was like something another person was feeling, something he acknowledged from a distance but didn't fully experience. And so he walked. He lost track of how far he walked and for how long, but when he finally looked up from the sidewalk ahead of him, the sky was dim, almost fully dark. The area was lit by streetlights, and the sign above the entrance of the various shops and parlors that lined the city street ahead and to each side of him. Tim blinked. Where was he? How far had he come? He'd walked for hours, that was clear, but in which direction? He didn't recognize any of the stores on this block, or the street, two-laned and moderately trafficked, at all. Tim went to turn around to get back to a place he knew, but stopped when his eyes landed on a storefront directly to his right. It was brightly lit and constructed in an old-fashioned manner that evoked images of comfortable diners. Through the large windows on the storefront, he saw white tables, surrounded by pastel-colored chairs, and a glass-covered display counter in the back. Baked goods were in the case, and an elderly woman in a flowery dress with a white apron over top held court behind the counter. The sign over the storefront wasn't lit, but somehow it was still easily readable. Miss Melody's Cafe. Though he was still outside, the place radiated warmth, comfort, and welcoming attraction, and Tim could not help but step toward the swinging front door. Then he was inside, and arpeggiated classical guitar music swept over his body from speakers he could not see. The fragrance of baked bread and other more sweet pastries that he could not name flooded his nose, along with a comforting warmth that somehow was lacking in the streets outside. Immediately, it was like the tension in his body was leaving him, and he walked slowly toward the counter in the back. The woman there had her gray hair up in a bun atop her head. Her round face turned toward him as he approached, and she put on a smile of welcoming compassion as he came to stop in front of her. "Good evening, dear. I'm Miss Melody," she said. "Hello," Tim replied by rote, though he had no idea what to really say to her. She seemed to understand and nodded at him, then bent over to pick up something from behind the counter. When she straightened, she had a platter of cookies in her hands. Chocolate chip, and apparently freshly baked. One of them was broken in half, and the chocolate of the chips inside it was running, still hot and smooth from the oven. Miss Melody extended the plate across the counter toward him. Tim reached out toward the cookies by instinct, but stopped before he could take hold of one. He looked back toward her. "How much?" Her smile increased a fraction. "First-time visitors are free, dear," she said, and it seemed the air rang with her words for a heartbeat. Tim nodded thanks, then selected one of the cookies and raised it to his mouth. It was warm as advertised, and moist and chewy, and the chocolate ran smoothly as he bit into it, just as its companion's innards had spilled so easily onto the plate. The sweetness swept from his tongue through the rest of his body in a spasm of bliss that swept the numbness and the fiery anger beneath from him as though it had never existed. For a time he was lost in the sensation of biting, chewing, and swallowing, and that was the entire span of his universe. Only that pleasant warmth, the ecstatic flavor. But then after a few moments the cookie was gone. Tim opened his eyes, he hadn't realized he had closed them, to find Miss Melody looking at him patiently, with a kind smile still on her lips. "Feeling better, dear? Would you like some more?" Tim opened his mouth to say yes, but then his cell phone beeped in his pocket. He flinched, then pulled it out and looked down. It was a text from Shania, his girlfriend, the latest of more than a dozen over the last several hours. "Where are you? Are you okay?" The time at the top of his cell phone screen took him aback. He had been walking for a good 5 hours, and he was supposed to meet up with her an hour and a half ago. He'd blown her off without realizing it, and now she was worried about him. "No thanks," he said, not looking up from his phone. "I gotta go." Somehow he registered Miss Melody nodding in response, though he wasn't looking at her. "I understand," she said. "Come back any time." Something in her voice made him look back up at her, and he did so just in time to see her pull the top page off a calendar pad that was set up to his right atop the counter. It was one of those pads that showed the current date and could be pulled off easily, and when she did so, he could have sworn he saw little golden yellow sparks fly away from the adhesive joint where the pages were bound together for a second. Miss Melody held the page out to him, and he took it. Glancing down, he saw the date dominated the page in bold, easy-to-read letters. At the top was Miss Melody's cafe in the same script as on the sign out front. Below the date was the image of Jesus holding a lamb in his hands, walking with apparent confidence and tender care through knee-high grass. "The Lord is my shepherd" was written in script below the image. Then below that was the address to Miss Melody's cafe. "Thanks," he said, and looked back up at her and smiled in a way that he hoped was grateful. "I'll do that." She nodded to him, and he turned to go. When he reached the door, a bell overhead rang when he pulled it open. He couldn't remember the bell from when he came in, but he cast that from his mind and stepped across the threshold. The world dissolved into golden white light. He was sitting in a small room with a set of bunk beds on one wall. The walls were whitish gray and dirty, as though they hadn't been cleaned in quite some time. There were no other furnishings in the room except for a seatless toilet against the rear wall and a small sink adjacent to the toilet. He was on the lower bunk, and another man was next to him. They both were wearing orange prison jumpsuits. The man was Hispanic, bearded, and about 45 years old, with closely cropped beard and brown eyes. He had a book open on his lap, and he was running a finger along one page as he read. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was placed upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. The man looked up from the page at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you understand?" he asked. He was standing in a common room next to the Hispanic man. The man was about 5 years older now, but still strong and vibrant. There was a group of 10 or 15 men seated in chairs, looking at the Hispanic man while he stood, holding the book and reading from it. He watched from his friend and mentor's side, feeling pride in his friend's ability to speak the word, but also joyful that he could participate and assist. He stood next to the Hispanic man, now much older, as he lay on the floor convulsing. Men in blue guards' uniforms pushed him aside to get to the Hispanic man, and others in clothing that labeled them medics followed. They checked the Hispanic man over, then put him on a stretcher and wheeled him away. His Bible lay on the floor where he had lain, forgotten in the haste to get him out of there. He was sitting in another cell in the prison just like the first. Another man sat next to him. This man was younger, just barely in his 20s, and blond, with piercing green eyes and a perpetually haunted expression on his face. He read from the Bible, the same passage his Hispanic friend had used all those years ago to help bring him peace and faith. And over the minutes he saw the young blond man's expression easing as he began to understand the message. The blond, green-eyed man was older now, standing at his side as he addressed a gathering of 20 or 30 men in orange jumpsuits, all gathered in the common room. The TV was going behind them, but no one paid attention. One man tried to barge in to watch something, but all eyes turned on him, and he quickly faded away. Then they looked back at him, and he read to them, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures." He walked out of the prison in clothes he no longer recognized but somehow still fit him after all these years. His eyes lighted on Tim, accompanied by his bride, still as beautiful as the first time he met her when they came to talk to him at visitation time, after they decided to get married. Their children were with them now, grown. With the grandchildren, they made quite a brood awaiting him in the parking lot. Seemed like they took up half the place. Tim walked toward him apart from the others, and they met and embraced, and he felt joy. Joy at release, and at being with his brother and his family again, but not joy for freedom. He had been free for years. The world dissolved away into blackness, then a single spark of golden light came into being. Sam's face was easy to see within it. From that spark of light showered dozens, hundreds more. The faces within them were unrecognizable, but at the same time somehow familiar. Faces of men that Sam had helped to lead to truth, peace, and joy of true freedom even while within physical bondage. The faces rushed past, one after another in a stream that seemed like it would never end. Tim staggered backward as the world snapped back into place around him, the kaleidoscope of faces in gold and white abruptly returning to the calm, warm interior of Miss Melody's cafe. For a minute he just stood there, stunned. Had he seen... was it real? He shook his head, then looked back toward the old woman behind the counter. She just looked at him, the same kindly smile on her face. "Feeling all right, dear?" Tim blinked, then realized that yes, he did feel better. He nodded. "Yes, was that real?" Miss Melody didn't reply, just raised an eyebrow at him. His thoughts whirled. Had he seen the future? Seen what Sam would experience? Some of it, at least? If that was so... No, it couldn't be. What is this place? Miss Melody just pointed up and behind herself, to where the same sign as hung above the place out front hung. But now he noticed the text underneath the cafe's name. Food for the body, healing for the soul. Tim shook his head, trying to make sense of it. He couldn't believe that what he had just seen was real, but at the same time, the anger, the fury over his brother's fate was gone. Well, not completely gone. It would never be gone for as long as he lived, he knew that. But it was reduced from a towering blaze that had only not overwhelmed him because of his own disbelief into a glowing ember. An ember that he knew instinctively that he could control and use to fuel something good. But above all that was peace. Peace that he didn't think he'd be able to feel again, the assurance that it was all going to turn out right, for lack of a better word, the way God intended. Tim wasn't sure how he could believe that, but still not believe that what he had seen and felt was real. Maybe it was. But that peace was real, he knew that much. He shook his head, then focused in on the old woman again. "Who are you?" "I told you, dear. I'm Miss Melody." That didn't answer the question, but the finality of her voice said she would give no better answer. So instead of pressing it, he said, "Can I come back?" "We are always open to souls in need," she replied. He nodded, then turned away toward the door. His cell phone chirped again as he stepped through out onto the street. He looked at it again. Shania, of course. He'd have to go deal with her, but somehow he didn't feel the urgency he had a lifetime ago. For a second, he didn't know why. Then he realized it wasn't her face he had seen beside him through Sam's eyes. Tim spun around and looked back at Miss Melody's cafe. And it wasn't there. The store behind him was a smoke and vape shop. What the... He looked down at the piece of calendar paper that he still held in his left hand and blinked when he saw that it had changed. The date was the same, and the picture of Jesus carrying the lamb, but the address had shifted. Now it just read, "Wherever needy souls are located." He looked back up at the totally normal storefront in front of himself and swallowed. Then he opened up the Uber app on his cell phone. He wasn't sure what his next step was going to be, but he knew one thing. Whatever happened, he was going to be all right. And so was Sam. He wanted to meet Sam when he came out from prison, meet him the way that vision showed him he would. So he put the numbness and the anger aside and turned to face forward. Okay, Miss Melody helps again. This is a pretty rough situation for Tim and his brother, and obviously he gets to see the silver lining there, and hopefully he's going to go on and do great things, and everything will come out as the vision showed him. Of course, you know how visions work. Maybe it'll come out exactly the way it was. Maybe it won't. Future's not set, obviously, in many ways. And but yeah, that turns out pretty. It's still sucky, but at least he's dealing with it a little better now. Did not intend to have this be very religiously themed. I like to say, a exceptionally bad Christian. And take that how you want to, but I do occasionally touch on overtly on religious themes. But a lot of times, you can't stop having your worldview go through stories when you're writing them. So often there will be moralities and discussions in stories that I write, like every writer will. This one was a little more on the nose than most that I do, but I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think it's a really good thing. I like how this one turned out. Hopefully you did too. If you did, you guys all know what you need to do. The first thing, of course, is if you haven't already subscribed to this channel or to the podcast or wherever it is you're hearing this, make sure you do that. Make sure you tell all your buddies so that they can enjoy the great stories around here too. The next thing, you got to go buy books. Right? This whole thing is about showing people my stories, so people will go and buy books. The best place to do that is michaelkingswood.com/store. That will get you to the store that my company operates, and that way you bypass the middleman, get money directly to the writer that you like without having big corporations take a chunk out of it. We have a direct one-to-one relationship. It's great. Of course, if you like going through Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Kobo or Google Play or iBooks or all the other places where you can get books out there, you can, of course, go to michaelkingswood.com/books to read, the number 2. That will get you to a universal book link aggregator that will show pretty much all the books I have out there, and you can click on it and get you to whatever store you want. Better to come through me, but up to you. The other things you can do, of course, at the beginning of this video, there was the discussion of the Kickstarter campaign that is going on until this coming Tuesday, the 26th. It is going to be ending the afternoon, I think around 5 p.m. Pacific time. That is to support the launch of the 7th book in my heroic fantasy series, the Glimmer Chronicles. And we've already passed the goal, but like to get some stretch goals met. So if you want to go, if you like fantasy books that are fun with great characters, go check that out and back the campaign. That'd be awesome. Let's see, we also got a subscribe star thing going that I put out there. Not much is going on with it. Would like for them to be. So check that out too. The link's in the back. What else is going on? Well, what else is going on is we're going to do another story next week on Saturday, because it's Story Saturday. That's going to be the 8th story from the first volume of last year, and that is called Watching Big Ben. Now, this one is, so I went to a workshop last year on how to write time travel romance stories, and this is one of the stories I wrote for that. So that tells you right there what it is. It's a fun little short, actually it's a short little time travel thing. It's kind of fun. So come back next week, we will go through that. That's all I got for now. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time. Until then, don't do anything I wouldn't do.